Okay, our passage today is from the book of Mark, chapter 2, verse 23. One Sabbath day, Jesus took a walk through the grain fields, and the disciples began to pick ears of grain as they went along. The Pharisees said to Jesus, "Look, why are they doing something on the Sabbath day that is forbidden?" And Jesus replied, "Did you never read what David did in his time of need when him and his followers were hungry? How David went into the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the loaves of offering, which only the priests are allowed to eat, and how he also gave some to those with him?" Then Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. That is why the chosen one is ruler even of the Sabbath."
Again, thank you for being here. Spring break is always a bit spotty, so it's great to have y'all here. We're in a series on things that I believe have kind of fallen out of the Christian tradition. We looked at the divine name, which was so important to the Jewish faith, but most Christians, I don't think, even know what the name is. I think it's God. So we looked at that word as a symbol of mystery. We looked at Shema, to love God with all of your heart, mind, and strength, which means that you kind of have to be responsible for your life. Nobody can tell you what to think or feel, or in the long run, what to do. So these are safeguards to sanity that I think if Christianity were to put them back in place, I think a lot of the stuff that we're seeing happening on the national front would not be, at least not as popular as it is now. Because basically what we're seeing is a rudderless religion. Something that clearly has never heard the Sermon on the Mount, may have listened to it as a side reading or something like that. But these aren't bad people. These are people who have never been taught to listen to their own heart, who've never been delivered from the kind of fear that many people feel that they're going to be punished if they're ever authentic, or if they say what they really believe or think or feel. Today we're going to look at the idea of the Sabbath. Some of the meanest people I've ever known in life were really good theologians. They were able to look at the text, they were able to look at the creeds, and come up with some really creative and inventive theologies, but they just didn't like people that much. Which, when the early church summarized the teaching as to love, that's really, really, really different. And that love has got to include compassion for real people in real situations. And that's where the Sabbath comes in. What I want to suggest is the Sabbath originally was a human rights declaration, an animal rights declaration, an ecological responsibility. I'm going to read, if I'd had foresight, I would have put this on a slide, and you wouldn't have to listen to me. So I'm going to read this, but listen for the fact that there's nothing in here about going to church. So when it talks about making the Sabbath holy, it's not talking about what most Christians are talking about. See if you agree with that after I read. This is from Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy, it really fleshes out the fourth commandment, and it's like a third to half of the whole Ten Commandments as it's spread out. It goes, honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as your God commanded. For 6 days you will labor and do all of your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to God. You will do no work on that day, And this is where it goes beyond. So far it's been spoken to the powerful, right? The leaders, the educated. Now listen to the conditions that are here that go with that. You'll do no work on that day, neither you, your daughter, nor your son, nor your workers, women or men, nor your ox or your donkey, nor any of your animals, and this is a little bit insensitive, or even foreigners. So below donkeys, just below donkeys. But they're still doing better than Texas, right? I mean, this is a world better than Governor Abbott. So even the foreigners among you, remember time and time again, the condition for God's covenant with human beings is not to mistreat immigrants, sojourners. We don't get to take that out, right? It nullifies the covenant to mistreat immigrants. Thus your workers, both women and men, will rest as you do. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and that your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. Because of this, your God has commanded to keep the Sabbath day holy. And again, it's not saying come to church, although I'm glad you did. But this is talking about human rights, animal rights, ecological sustainability. And it's right there in the Ten Commandments. Think about how many times you've heard sermons on that. Or conversely, how seldom you've heard that even brought up. That when people talk about the Sabbath, it's don't play on the Sabbath. I had a friend his dad was a minister in my childhood neighborhood, and he couldn't read funnies on the Sabbath. So isn't it funny that something about workers' rights gets morphed into something, don't have fun. Don't go to the pool hall, come to church. But this is saying that how we treat people weaker than us is pivotal in the covenant that God is wanting to have with Israel. There's a sense in which the Sabbath is like the warning label on medicine. This is saying when you don't take the medicine. It's saying if somebody is sick, you stop. You stop being religious for just a minute and just be compassionate. In our story, the people are hungry. So if Jesus was going to be religious, he would not do work on the Sabbath. Right? He takes grain and he does what the religious leaders all say don't do. It's a pretty safe rule to whatever the clergy say, do something else. At least do some research on it. Because in Scripture, as uncomfortable as that may make me, Jesus used clergy a lot more as a bad example than a good example. Because once religion goes on autopilot, it doesn't get to the kind of love that's really the whole point. So Jesus says something that the church hasn't exactly said, and that is that the Sabbath was made for human beings, not human beings for the Sabbath. Now that's Jesus, and not to be heretical, but I think Jesus has had some kind of say in what the religion that bears his name says. And what I hear that saying is not just the Sabbath, but religion itself is made to be helpful to human beings. Human beings were not created to obey the religious rules. Critically important. How many people here, you don't have to raise your hand, I'm not, rhetorical question, have been in a situation where religion made you feel worse about yourself? Not because something bad you've done, but who you are. What you felt. Or something you've done, and maybe it was even a mistake. But you got the idea that human beings were made to be religious. And the guy was sitting there like a judge, counting the mistakes. In the original scripture, it was Satan that did that. Satan was the critic. Satan was the judge. Satan was the one that's trying to trip people up. Somehow, in traditional theology, the roles were reversed. Where this compassionate parent who's whispering in our ear for us to find our best self is seen as the tempter. And the judge that sits there and criticizes us all the time is seen as the person sitting on the throne. The Sabbath is a reminder that it's about living and loving. And religion can be very helpful to do that, but can also be the worst obstacle that's possible. Clergy can be very helpful as cheerleaders as you try to find your own voice, find your own direction, or we can be stumbling blocks where we make religion the end and not the means for where we need to go. So we're going to look at this notion. The Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. And say you have not only the right, but you have the responsibility to say no to religion when it is unloving, when it's not helpful, when it's not wise. It seems to me, and again, what you think is more important. I'm never trying to get you to put your wisdom to the side and take up mine. I'm just doing the best I can to do some unpacking here. Trust your own wisdom with this. But it seems to me that part of what the Sabbath is a day set aside or a time set aside to remember your own heart. The word means to sit or to be still. And in the mythology, the idea was God worked for 6 days and then rested. God sat. Where God found a chair that big, I don't know. But I think what the clergy were trying to do was say, everybody gets to rest. Even God got to rest in the story. But it's not just you, it's your workers. It's your animals. It's your field. Everybody gets to rest and have some time just to be alive. For people, it's just to find your own heart and listen to your own heart. Because life can be so immediate that you lose touch with that. And you can't hear it over all the shouting voices in your ear telling you what to think, what to do, who to be. Time can be a tyrant. You can feel like you're always rushing to get someplace. The Sabbath is stepping out of calendar time, out of chronological time, out of clock time, and listening to the rhythms within you. You can only do that if you stop. And sometimes we're so afraid to stop. We've been running for so long, we've been, living off of adrenaline for so long that we're afraid that if we slow down, everything's going to fall apart. Usually things are already falling apart, and slowing down and having some time just to heal. Rabbi Heschel called the Sabbath a palace in time. You set aside a time with nothing on the agenda other than resting, renewing yourself. And it's seen as something essential, not as being selfish, but you get to decide what that is. That may be sitting on the back porch. I mean, it's wonderful to have you here, but I suspect this isn't your real Sabbath, right? Your real Sabbath may be nature. It may be jogging. It may be gardening. But it's something where you carve out time for yourself and you just listen to your own heart. That's part of what I think Jesus means when he says, you weren't made for religion. Religion was made to be helpful to you. So first is listening to your heart. Second, I think, is tuning the heart to nature and to life. Remember, when Jesus wants to start his ministry, he takes people away from the temple, away from their businesses, out to the countryside and says, look at the birds. Just study them. If you want to know what I'm teaching, let's start here. Look at the birds, look at the flowers. I'm calling you to your natural self, to who you really are. In the mythology, God created the world in 7 days. If you hope to get through college, it's important to realize that's not true. Unless it's Liberty College or something like that. Christian biology is different, a little different kind of. But the reason that was important, and important for us not to lose that, is that they had a lunar calendar. A lunar calendar. Which means if they stopped every 7th day, in 4 weeks they would be lined up with the moon. Which is a much more natural way to do that. I'm not suggesting that you can pull that one off. But I'm saying stepping out of your calendar sometimes, stepping out of your clock, the things of trying to get someplace else. I am devastated, and a lot of this is psychosomatic, I understand, but daylight savings time, I hate it. And most of it is my immaturity. I realize that just sitting there before I go to bed, I'm going to lose an hour, I'm going to lose an hour. I'll do that for about 3 hours, so it's damage I do to myself. But not all of it's imaginary. Think of jet lag. That we are made not independently of our environment, but to be in tune with our environment. Not just driving by forests and stuff, but taking it in, slowing down our breath and our heartbeat and all of these kinds of things, because we're part of a larger life. Next month, there's going to be something. I want to do a challenge. I almost never ask you to do something, but I have a request. What's happening in the sky this next month? Total solar eclipse in some places. I want to implore you to travel however far you do to get to totality. The difference between an almost total solar eclipse and a total solar eclipse, you will not believe. 1 second before totality, it's a different world. The light changes somehow. The insects get still. The birds stop singing and making motion. It instantly cools down. Now, unfortunately, when I did that in Mexico, the government fired fireworks during totality. So I want to give it another shot. That was very disappointing, to set aside that time, to travel to that time, and think you're going to top a solar eclipse with fireworks. But that kind of thing, maybe that won't ring your bell, but what would? Where is it that you remember what it is to be a human being? Where you can feel your greatness inside. The first thing the Sabbath could be is setting aside time to hear our own heart, to get still enough. The second is to get still enough to feel our ties to the web of life, to what happens in the sky. Then the third thing is maybe the less pleasant, but in some ways, at our time, maybe the most important in some ways, and that is to tune your heart to justice for your entire human family. The fourth commandment talks over and over again about who doesn't have to work. If we're blending in Texas, basically if you're not in jail, you're probably cooperating with some really evil stuff here in Texas. Not your fault. I agree with those who say you can worship God under a tree. Absolutely. But there's also something about tuning your heart to humankind. It's not as pleasant. But anybody can like a Jesus you've made up in your own mind. Like you just take grandma, you like that trait, you like grandpa there, Uncle Joe, your favorite teacher, and then that's Jesus, the amalgam of that. Probably I wouldn't get along with Jesus at first, right? I probably have to do some changes before that worked. When our hearts are not tuned to each other, when they're not tuned to our common humanity, we become competitors. Again, from the cradle, this is what you were taught. The insanity of nationalism, the insanity of capitalism. Any scale you put yourself on that measures your value is an abomination. Because you are more valuable than any system of value there is. When you think you're more important because you have more things, you have no idea of what's radiating out of you, the importance, the gift that is there to all of us. And sometimes what has to go first is religion, at least the religious propaganda, the religious teaching. Jesus healed on the Sabbath and broke the rules. And the clergy came and jumped on him, and he kept doing it. And what he was saying is the purpose of the Sabbath is to heal. That's the purpose of it. My people are hungry. They need food. You can't teach people to pray when they're hungry. So it's a calling to a kind of love of human beings as we really are. And I really think that's a part of what the Sabbath is too. There are people in this room, I know, who feel bad about themselves sometimes because of what religion has said to them. I know that is a fact. I know that sometimes people feel bad about themselves because of something a clergy has said in the name of God, in the name of the church, in the name of Christ. Jesus went to those people. He called them the stones the builders have rejected and said, this is what I'm building the temple with. We are called out of traditional Christianity. You can't do this if you don't become mystical and radical and all of those things. It has to come from your heart. It has to tie you to life. And somehow you have to say yes to your human family with all of our insanity. Because if we go into the civil war at which we're headed, it's going to break all of our hearts. Whatever we have to do, the core of it has to be love. Even the core of justice is love. So to step out of the false sense of sinfulness and failure and realize that you are God's gift to the world. You are the light of the world. With all your imperfections, those are true, those are real as well. But Jesus said, if you're on your way to the temple to give your gift to God at the temple, and you remember somebody has something against you, leave your gift and go make up with that person. Again, don't you think Jesus should have some say in this? The church is wonderful. I've given my life to it. But that's not what Jesus was talking about. Jesus is talking about humanity, love, reality, life. And you can't learn that in a class. You have to wake up to it everywhere. So I believe that the Sabbath is one of the pillars of sanity that Christianity desperately needs again. I think it's saying, reminding us that we have not only the right, but the duty to bring humanity to religion. I believe the Sabbath is whenever we stop to listen to our own heart. I think the Sabbath is whenever we stop and remember that we are part of the web of life and in nature. And we look at the sky and feel the awe. And finally, when we realize that our poor, pitiful species is in the process of destroying itself. And the only way we can help is to become more loving at a level that many of us have never known ourselves, but it's in there. So what Jesus says is whatever happens, remember this. You were not made to serve religion. Religion was invented to serve you. Well, that's my understanding of the text. Obviously, feel free to disagree. We'll take a moment where you can think about your own understanding of these words.